to Voices from the CEPS Ideas Lab. In this episode, I spoke with Luca Nipius. Luca is a research assistant at the Energy, Resources and Climate Change Unit at CEPS. During our interview, we discussed the green transition and the concept of sufficiency, looking at how to reduce the resource consumption of various industries and how to integrate it more into EU-wide policy. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, welcome, Luca. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Look, when looking at the green transition, there are multiple obstacles and challenges, and yet the EU has this comprehensive Green Deal. However, there are areas that are lagging. For you, is there a particular priority when it comes to some of those areas that are lagging?
Yeah, so for me, one of the main obstacles that we still have to face, I think, in our policies is our resource consumption.
Right.
We've progressed in many areas throughout the EU in the last decades, but this is a main one for me.
And what needs to be done there?
So for me, the concept of sufficiency can be well implemented there.
What do you mean by sufficiency?
So with sufficiency, you try to meet everyone's basic needs while staying within so-called planetary boundaries. So where you look at the resource consumption of different sectors.
Okay. And so give an example of how that would work. What are the planetary boundaries? How would sufficiency play into that?
Right. So for example, if you look at the construction sector,
okay.
When people need a new housing in countries, governments will think we're going to build new buildings. Whereas within sufficiency, what you try to do is you look at your existing buildings and see what can we achieve with those buildings so that you don't have to build new, because, well, the building sector, the construction sector is responsible for a third of our resource consumption.
Yeah.
And we need to get that down to zero by 2050, right? So that's where sufficiency comes in, making better use of what we have.
It's about sort of retrofitting your existing housing stock to make it much more efficient, rather than using a third of your emissions to just build newer, potentially, newer houses are often better energy, consumption-wise, right?
Yeah.
Efficiency. But this is about retrofitting old stock. That's part of what sufficiency means.
It's one of the different ways in which it works. Another example in this sector is also more sharing spaces,
Okay.
where so within the same building, without compromising in your personal living space, you can fit more people. And we see that this is still a big problem in many member states, right? This housing crises. So it is really a permanent, or how do you say it, a relevant topic and issue. And that's where it also can come in today, rather than building new, which is done in 10 years.
Why do you think the EU specifically needs to implement sufficiency in order for it to thrive, in its Green Deal, in its hitting net zero agenda policies?
Yeah, so I think the power of the EU is that you have 27 different countries, which means if you try to achieve this at an EU level, you can learn lessons from each other. Right. And so to make sure that this is done equally also throughout member states, you do need this, let's say, across EU definition of what can be done, how is it defined, and in what sectors is the most potential for this. This is different per member states, but still there's a lot of cooperation that I think can be done at EU level.
And you mentioned the different sectors that it could be used in the most. I know you've just given construction as an example. Where else do you think it can be implemented very well, quickly, and see benefit?
So the transport sector is also what we see in let's say, academia, very often quoted area, because here our focus and our problems are often related to the singular use of our transport. And we all know that bikes are good and public transport are good, but you can go further than that and go more into details where you look at, for example, the size of cars,
okay.
right? We have the Americanization of cars where they take up more space, they're more deadly, they require more resources, and they're less efficient.
Yeah.
So from a policy perspective, it makes sense to attack this issue. But then the usual suspects like public transport and cycling are still within the sufficiency thinking for the transport sector.
I also want to go back to something you said right at the start about planetary boundaries. Do all of the different Is there a kind of universal planetary set of boundaries when it comes to the EU's green deals, or does it differ by sector, and does efficiency play differently in the sectors?
So that's interesting and difficult because we have 9 planetary boundaries, which is a scientific concept, but they definitely don't necessarily directly translate into sectors. However, we have many indicators and measure sticks to make that translation. And so, for buildings, it's quite obvious. I mean, there's a lot of waste being generated with buildings through demolishment.
Okay.
And that then connects, of course, to some of the waste streams that then connect to the planetary boundaries. It can get very physical, so it's hard to make that translation. But yeah, there are many ways to translate that.
And how could sufficiency be incorporated into policy making?
So actually, some principles of sufficiency have already been embodied in EU policies. We've got the waste hierarchy, which then, let's say, prefers preventing waste over reusing waste, over recycling waste, and only then do we burn it for energy.
Yeah.
That's one example. We have the right to repair, so consumers have better means to use their consumer products for a longer amount of time, right? These are principles that, sure, you can buy a new one, but you have this machine, and apart from one little piece, everything still works, so why buy a new one?
Yeah.
Right? Other examples, actually, in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which, again, in the building sector. Last year, it was proposed by the European Parliament to include sufficiency principles. So it's not completely new. There are other areas where really on product-specific things, you can make things more simple in the way that they are built.
So what needs to be done now for sufficiency to be integrated into European policy, and what does it look like going forward?
Right, so I think with most novel concepts that get introduced at an EU level, you need an EU-wide definition so that policymakers from different sectors, but also from different member states, make sure that they're talking about the same thing. Then also, I already mentioned a few directives that are implementing sufficiency, but there's a lot of them that have potential for it to be implemented. So one example there is the Public Procurement Directive, where public projects from national governments, they can incorporate these principles so that it gets more integrated slowly into new markets, let's say. Another example is the construction product regulation. So I talked about buildings more generally, but also for specific products. You can, for example, make sure that certain parts of new buildings are disassemblable so that you can reuse it into new buildings, right? Then to make sure that everything is monitored well and to make sure that there's a reporting framework for member states, including it into the national energy and climate plans is very relevant here because we're still talking about the same topic of the planet and the resources that we use. And so there member states can make sure that they show what their progress has been, and also, again, that member states can learn from each other. And then lastly, there also could be more possibilities for financing options.
Yeah.
So you have the Just Climate Fund, where if you dedicate a section to sufficiency, you can really get more funding into these proposals. And that's also a right place to be, because not only is it about this resource consumption, but it's also really getting basic needs in there. So hence the just transition.
Brilliant. Well, Luca, I mean, look, it looks like it's such an important area to be discussed about more. So I'm glad that you're concentrating on it, and let's hope that sufficiency is integrated much more into European policy. But thank you for your time today, and good luck with everything in the future.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.